Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Hacking Kubernetes live demo marathon. This will be a light speed blitz through lots of Kubernetes flavored attacks and vulnerabilities. My laptop died a catastrophic failure of death yesterday, so I've reverted to a 4 to 5 year old device. I believe everything is lined up, but we shall see. We'll discover collectively. Right. So, hello, I'm Andy, CISO here at Open UK and CEO of Control Plane. I've written various bits and bobs over the years. Very proud of the book Hacking Kubernetes that I wrote with my esteemed co-author, Mr. Michael Hassenblas. And copies of the book are, in fact, we have some copies here. If anybody didn't get one in the great book giveaway yesterday, I believe there are a number of copies with my esteemed colleagues over on this table, 4 copies. So do bum rush the show should you desire one of those. And also it's available as a download for the first half there at the bottom. We do lots of cloud native security things. This is what it looks like. And you can work with us if you think we are credible. And I'll try and disprove that over the course of this presentation. Okay, we will talk about threat modeling Kubernetes, how to hack a thing. We'll go through a number of different demos. And then hopefully, over the course of this presentation, you will see what happens when a supply chain attack turns into a cluster assault with a container breakout and an escalation to cloud account takeover, what not to do with your production services. Multitudinous and unvaried thanks to all who have gone before me. Some of these are other demos that I've done as well. And of course, the esteemed Liz Rice is a huge inspiration for a lot of these things. This is what happens when your security team sees Kubernetes. Raw, unfettered terror. So what is the problem? Someone else's code running in our production clusters, and in this case, it is the 8-bit monstrosity Dread Pirate Captain, Hashjack. He wants to run his code in your clusters. This is ultimately what a supply chain attack looks to gain, but it's also what remote code execution enables. And what might he do then? Well, perhaps steal some data, run some sort of crypto mining or crypto jacking where either data is locked and ransomed back, or we just do the good old Bitcoin or Monero sort of generation stuff, and it's Control Plane's archetypal adversary. This is a pod treasure map straight from the book. What does one do when they have assaulted a cluster and got inside a container? Well, containers are just a microcosm of Linux, but there are additional things added to the container. Of course, things are namespaced. We have C groups, capabilities, wrap the thing, probably by default. We have our Linux security modules, which are our mandatory access control, providing a system call filtering barrier of some description. Maybe they reach into user space to check whether or not we can access a file or perform a certain activity. We also have, of course, the different namespaces kind of divided out here. This is the way that I like to penetration test on client engagements. This and more available in the book, of course. So before we jump into the meat and potatoes of attacking a cluster, first of all, let's think about how we would defend against some of these things and what is the most important thing to do when defending a cyber thing. It is to quantify and qualify the adversary against which it is being defended. In this case, as I say, the Dread Pirate Captain Hashjack is our nefarious adversary. Why is this important? Well, first of all, we want to know who's attacking us, but second of all, who are we in this case? We can see that, for example, a government intelligence agency has a much higher barrier or much more resource to expend in the defense of its digital estate versus perhaps a game startup. And in concrete terms, we're looking at, for example, the NSA hacking tools being exfiltrated and dumped on the internet. Very embarrassing, kind of changes the game in some ways, versus Valve's source code for Half-Life being leaked. Very different adversaries. In one case, you have another foreign intelligence service. In the other case, you have an aggravated, spotty teenager. But the outcome can still be reputational damage in whatever way. This, at Control Plane, is how we analyze our adversaries. I have considered adding AI ML as a new layer to this threat matrix, but as yet, the capabilities are not yet developed. Really, probably what we expect in that domain is for permutations of different attacks to be combined and threaded together in a way that we haven't seen so far, because there is, what would you call it, kind of an unfettered set of, there are no pre-constraints as a pen tester would kind of have their own guidelines. And potentially at some point we're going to see custom implants and exploits developed by AI systems that humans have not yet developed. That will be very interesting and purely terrifying. But in the case of what we have here, we start off at the top with a Vandal, a script kiddie. Minimum viable cloud-native security is not being vulnerable to published CVEs. If somebody can download Kali Linux or Metasploit or Paris OS and run the CVEs that are bundled in those distributions against your systems and break in, well, that's probably professional negligence at the very least. We can do better than that because we have the tools and the scanners to get us there by default. We move into motivated individuals, probably a few more skills. If we look at the capabilities column, those publicly available exploits, maybe we can modify them slightly. Maybe we're going to try and get in through a supply chain, which is so hot right now, of course. We get into insider threats. That becomes a little bit difficult. We're looking at organizational separation of duty and privilege, monitoring and logging, all those good things. Excuse me. Then we get into organized crime. So these are our nation-state affiliated groups, our APTs. Fancy Bear is a good one. There's a lot of work done by Western intelligence agencies looking at how Russia funnels money through Swiss bank accounts. A lot of published research. It's kind of plausibly deniable, gray area, but still linkable and, yes, fascinating if you're into that kind of thing. We get to cloud services insiders. We're talking about the Capital One hack, for example, where an ex-employee used privilege information to get a server-side request forgery into a web application firewall with an overprivileged IAM account, reads an S3 bucket, dumps customer data, poster child for the cloud, pwned, and then finally foreign intelligence services. This is where you might lose some fingers. So ultimately, when there's a physical threat, it is at this point that we rely on the previous layers of controls to not give one person the access to become a target for a foreign service. And then at the bottom, we have HAL from Space Odyssey. Right, next we get to how we model these things. It is far more difficult for a defensive organization because we must check every box. This is right in my beard, or the remnants of it. So we must check every box in order to, I'm looking at my blue team T-shirts, in order to make sure that we have a full coverage of the things that we're trying to defend against. For an attacker, it is a very different story. An attacker needs to take one foothold into an organization, observe the visible horizon, and pivot to wherever they can find. It is a defender's job to lock down every single one of those endpoints, which is a far more difficult proposition. So we use attack trees. This takes the attacker's mindset and gives a visible path through an attack, or kill chain as traditionally they were called, maps it to a diagram such as this, and then allows us to cut the branches, essentially, by placing controls over them. A control may span more than one branch. This gives us a few things. First of all, it is a quantifiable log of what we're doing to defend the system. Why is this important? Because maintainers in the future probably want to know when they're shipping a new feature why the security control exists. It also gives the very abstract and often abstruse, unquantifiable security, probably best to use air burners for security, decision-making process, some actual, again, quantifiability. It's a shared taxonomy for people to be able to discuss things, and it makes sense to kind of allay some of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that comes with the arm-wavy security that often we see in the industry. Finally, it's also often a way to optimally apply controls, because if one control can cover multiple different attack paths, well, then the cost of implementation, the cost of maintenance, and the maintainability of the thing is likely to probably be a little bit easier than individual controls for every single piece that come maybe from a more sort of terrified defensive fearfulness than sort of strong, well-defined controls. We do training on threat modeling. It is available on O'Reilly Online. We also do it privately, and a lot of that is open source as well. Okay, with that, let's get into the demo marathon. So, what are we going to do? We're going to think like an attacker. and an attempt not to panic. First of all, code to cloud attack patterns. We're looking to find that vulnerability and exploit. The 4 C's of Kubernetes security. We start with the code. This is where our application is defined. This could be running anywhere, frankly. It could be running on a laptop with in the host namespace, or in this case, it's packaged up into a container. The container is the code plus all the dependencies bundled up that it needs to run at runtime. It's a file system image codified as a tarball in OCI parlance. That runs, the invocation of that is kind of the object-oriented difference between an instance or a class and the instantiated object. That runs inside a cluster. Cluster is dealing with our cross-host service discovery, it's our network routing, all those good things, attachment of storage objects. And then finally, that runs in a cloud or a colo or a data center where our physical infrastructure, the tin, actually sits with whatever layers of virtualization. So we're looking to take a vulnerability in the code, use it to break out of the security controls of a container, which is the process essentially at runtime, then transcend the cluster in some way to attack the cloud. Okay, open source supply chain and processware. What is a supply chain? Anything that we depend upon. So a producer creates something, it is then consumed. Anything that you put on GitHub de facto makes you a producer in a supply chain mindset. Ultimately, what we're looking to do here as the Dread Pirate Captain Hashjack is to get in between Alice and Charlie and drop malware into the build or the distribution or some element of the supply chain. Supply chains are long and difficult to secure, and we've only just realized as an industry. There's lots of ways we can do this. We can go straight for the source code. We can infect an upstream, so SolarWinds style, or we can infect the runtime environment, which is a bit more difficult because there's a lot of trust that we place into the people who run our operating systems. And by that, I mean concretely the people who distribute the public keys of the root certificate authorities that we trust. That is the foundations of communicative trust on the internet. Okay, so for the first demo, we will drop some malware and an application dependency. That will attack the end user device that we're using, which is my laptop in this case. We will pull this package. The package is the thing that will run the malware. We'll steal some identity, put it that way. Right, so demo number 1. Let's see. How is that for visibility? That looks okay. Right, so we know that in here, okay, we've got a few things. So this is an NPM module. It would be, I believe, unethical to upload this to NPM, so I'm running it purely locally. And what we see is package.json, an exfil.sh, which looks suspicious, and the dependent node modules that it runs. So if we have a look at the contents of the, hi Stephen, sorry, I'll close that down. Okay, if we then look at the contents of the package.json, right, we see the name of the package is npm exfil. The version is leet in other terms. The description fills us with an all foreboding sense of dread. The scripts, okay, so we've got script test. Now what happens if we try and execute this? So we go npm run test. Okay, well, we've used a bash built in, which is echo. So we know that the contents of that, the value of test in the JSON is being executed in either a shell, in some probably POSIX compliant shell. So we can just run arbitrary code by dropping it into that bit of JSON. But what we've chosen to do here is actually execute another script. The only way, we can see it's a pre-install script. So the only way we would be able to test the contents of this for malicious behavior would be to download this separately from npm or to run it in a sandboxed safe environment. My laptop is neither of those things. So what am I going to do? npm install. I'm going to install from the local directory because of, the professional integrity stuff. So what happens? Well, it's downloaded the repo to my local machine. It then decides to run the pre-install hook, hopefully. Yep, still got, there we go. And it's running the exfil.sh script. This is a bad day for me because I've just installed the keylogger, and let's just zoom back up again. Where am I? There we go. Okay, so this keylogger is ignored by a lot of antivirus. That means even if I've got passwords on my credentials, which I absolutely should do by default, it can still sniff them from my keyboard input and then tie them back, and then that's my SSH key potentially compromised. Monero miner, because it's a little bit, I mean, crypto still exists at least. And my credentials, why are they important? Because this is executing in the environment of me as a user. And as a user, I have to be able to access my SSH key, my GPG key, my AWS credentials. What else might I have in there? Because those things are all supposed to be passworded. Well, actually, if we go into that AWS directory, had I recently authenticated to an AWS account, the OIDC flow takes a session token and it drops it on my local machine, so I don't have to constantly re-authenticate for the duration of the expiry of that token. That means if someone exfiltrates that, they have production access, pre-authenticated to my stuff. That's a bad day if I've just been performing production operations, because someone then has temporary access to those places, even if they haven't taken my AWS keys or they're actually sat in a vault as they should be and not on our local machines. Nevertheless, most of the time, this will yield positive results for an attacker. And I'm a version behind of NPM. Thank you very much. One down. So what does that mean? That means, so I just realign things, that we ran a backdoored open source package on my developer machine. This is just an NPM install. People do this all the time. It is de rigueur for most developers. That pre-install hook abused its local privilege, executing as my user to herd the things that I own and then pick them up, and then it pushes them to somewhere that I can write to. What could that be? Well, a modern version of this might be stick it in an OCI image and push it up to a container registry of some description. It could be put it into a Git repository and push it to GitHub. These are network routes that even corporate firewalls are probably going to have open, because pastebin has been identified as a source of potentially malicious data dumping these days. Install, exfiltrate, or foobar your stuff. Profit. Especially if one of those things is an SSH key to a Git repo, then people can go and potentially drop malicious code into your supply chain as you. But that's not what we're going to do. We're going to do something slightly different. We are instead going to drop a reverse shell. So what's reverse shell? Instead of me SSHing onto an open TCP port, so IP22, for example, a reverse shell is a connection from the victim host back to an endpoint the attacker controls. In the case of a Kubernetes cluster, of which this is one, we'll see, number one, we snuck malicious code into a target library. It's built, third-party dependencies also go into that process. The malicious dependency and the developer code are combined into that malicious image. CI/CD will happily build this without Trivy or another vulnerability scanning tool detecting it, because those tools and antivirus tools and malicious code analyzers look for specific patterns. As long as our code, in this case, simple reverse shell, is obfuscated or looks vaguely legitimate in some way, it is very unlikely to get detected. The difference here is that runtime container security tooling is perfectly capable of detecting reverse shells, so we will discuss that briefly later. The payload then runs in a production front-end container because we've deployed it there. And this container performs its usual operation. So it's been Trojanized in inverted commas. And what that means is the entry point of the application will still run, but using maybe an LD preload trick or rewriting the binary to spawn something else in its flow, fires this TCP connection from the victim container, in this case, out to this endpoint, this TCP/IP port that I'm holding open, and in this case I'll do it with an ngrok tunnel from my laptop, and then I'm catching that shell connection, and I then have command and control into the pod. So that glues together a bash shell, and that, as we'll see, gets us into the production infrastructure that we are targeting. Okay, so how do we fix this kind of stuff? Well, 2FA on everything, because if someone can lift those keys from your file system, then they are hosed. Otherwise, plain text credentials, it's simply awful, of course, as we know. So AWS keys are a particularly common one there. If we do care about crypto, hot wallets are a bad thing. Air-gapped development environments, it doesn't really work for most organizations. It is an imposition to expect that from many places. And finally, we consider signing. Actually, signing is only good to prove the transit of information between two endpoints. It says this person at this point in time liked this thing sufficiently to give it a signature, and then we re-verify it on the other side to say, well, yeah, okay, that's the same thing. Checksums will get us some of that distance. TLS will get us also some of that distance. So in the same space as SBOMs, code signing, none of these things are silver bullets. They must be part of a holistic, wider strategy in order to actually engender trust in the things that we care about. Okay, so supply chain reverse shell. We have our trusted producers. They push their things into NPM. As we saw, developer code builds a thing, trusted application, and Kubernetes. Dread Pirate Captain Hashjack is interested in that second phase. Whoops, one too many, there we go. So for these reverse shells, we see that we've exploited the victim's machine by virtue of dropping that implant into the application code. The victim's Kubernetes cluster will then fire that reverse TCP connection to the endpoint that we control. And this is the diagram we've just seen. So we're actually going to do this in a slightly different way via, instead of pushing vulnerable code to the internet, I will do it all locally. So we'll do it via malicious nginx image that we've backdoored. Still going to run a production container, fire the reverse shell, catch it, happy days. Courtesy of the Right Honourable Mr. Duffy Cooley and Ian Coldwater, when they first got together and scribbled on a whiteboard, they put this one-liner together. Happily now, there is also a double hyphen privileged flag for kube control, which is just a ludicrous and banana armor sort of behavior. I don't know how that got shipped, because privileged is the most dangerous flag in the history of computing. It turns off all namespaces apart from the process namespace. It disables seccomp, AppArmor, it gives all capabilities and namespace, and enables all C group, or disables all C group restrictions. So what we're doing here is we're taking a privileged container. We are running nsenter, which is namespace enter, a legitimate tool used for debugging invading namespaces. We are attaching that to proc1 ns-mount. So that is process number one in the proc virtual file system. That's like running PS and seeing the number one. That is an init system, generally. And the namespace is mount. This basically means we're going to start a shell in the mount namespace of PID1, which is privileged. So that's systemd on the host, because we're also sharing the PID namespace. Actually, PID namespace is the only thing the privilege does not enable, but we've also done that manually. And this will give us access to the host, going from misconfiguration to breakout. This should be protected with admission control. Things like Caverno or a pod security standard will get us there and stop this from being exploitable. But Kubernetes is not secure by default because these controls, these admission controls, are not enabled without additional effort. Okay, so we'll run this backdoored image, fire the reverse shell, catch the reverse shell from my laptop via ngrok. So there's actually a publicly routable IP, and that gives us our command and control. And we do so like this. Okay, so first of all, we will run this ngrok shell catcher, which is one I wrote earlier. Okay, so what we've done there, at the bottom, we've got the debug log from ngrok running. That's given us the DNS name of an endpoint. We've pulled we've just looked up the records and figured out that it is this IP address and that port. And then we've used the dev TCP virtual file system. This is only included in bash. It's a virtual file system that maps network endpoints to a file system. This is how most reverse shells are generated. It's ludicrous and bananas. You should not have bash in your containers because otherwise you're vulnerable to this. It doesn't exist for shell. It's a super easy way to get a backdoor and quite unfortunate. We're probably on this Kubernetes version. As I said, my laptop broke recently, which is an advanced excuse should I have to live debug this. Okay, so what we're expecting to see here, this terminal is locally attached to a pipe. The pipe will be attached to the ngrok tunnel, As we know with Linux, it's just going to block until something attaches to the other side. So let's check who we are. Nothing's attached. So that command is now buffered, just waiting to go through the pipe. Let's see if this works. OK, so what we're doing, Kubernetes run, reverse shell, output is YAML, dry run client, image subliminal hack. Then the executable, the command we're running is bin bash command, while true, do no hangup bash. That is going to attach the reverse shell to that bash session, which is the redirect there for both input and output, sleep one, and then just loop. So if it drops, it'll keep on trying that until something connects. Then we've got, we set that out, so we set host PID is true. Again, admission control should prevent this. Then we set the image, set the security context, tee it standard error so we can see what we've written, and then apply that whole line to the cluster. We hope that looks like it may have worked. Excellent. OK, so what's happened here is we ran this, and this is what we kind of munged and set it together. That got applied to the cluster. It's connected here, and the command that we ran, once the pipe connected, it wrote, so that's my local machine writing to a local pipe that goes up through ngrok, which has been connected to from the big wide internet, and we're now inside a Kubernetes pod. Or we assume we are. What would we do? Well, if we run env, we can see all the stuff that Kubernetes likes to dump in so that we know that that's where we are. But what else can we do? Well, let's just see what processes we've got running. OK, this is a bad day. Because we've enabled the process namespace, we can see all of the other processes running on the host. This is the kubelet node on which the container is running. From here, we know that we can do a reasonable amount of damage because, for example, we can see here container D. Container D is part of the container run process. See there, it's actually running run C. This is like a self-referential, like staring into the mirror for a container. It shouldn't be able to see the tree that gives it its, the process tree that gives it life. So we know that we're in trouble. We can see here that's actually the command that we were running. So we're in the process namespace. We can definitely cause some damage. What else would we do when we're here? Well, let's by default check the devices. OK, we can see the hard disks that belong to the host. Let's just, whoops-a-daisy. Oh, I closed it down. Rat bags. OK. Fortunately, because, hold on, that's the wrong one. Because we, OK, I'm going to have to hide this on the other screen, but let's do this. Yeah, because we've got that, well, because we have this no-hup looping, I can just go straight back in again. Actually, that's not what I want to do. Just run the same thing twice. What I want to do instead is the ncat, which is in there somewhere. What would I do? I will leave this because the point there is that we can break out onto the host, but we're going to do that in a more exciting way with the container breakout. So that's the way to do it via misconfiguration, which is kind of easy. Let's do it with the container breakout instead. There we go. That's a suitable excuse. Right, so what did we do? We ran that backdoored image. We got command and control in the container. I was going to take it one step further, but we don't need to for the purposes of demonstration. And on we go. That is the same thing. OK, so containers and vulnerabilities. There have been a lot of container vulnerabilities. There have been a lot of container vulnerabilities. Is anything ever truly secure? Well, no. There have been hypervisor breakouts. There are air-gapped traversals. It's a matter of risk balance and management. And while we see a lot of vulnerabilities here, actually, do we prefer to have static applications, a static infrastructure that doesn't progress, that doesn't ship features, or do we like to run a little bit faster and understand this risk balance between new features, potentially market competition with other businesses? My preference, of course, is yes, but your risk tolerance may vary, and in that case, use the appropriate tooling for the job. OK, it's not a container escape. It is a process that wants to be free. So what are we going to do here? Excuse me. Right, we start off with what we saw there was the middle path. We had a non-secured pod. We had poor admission control. We were able to misconfigure and deploy a pod, get remote code execution, and break out onto the host, which was incoming. What we'll do this time is take a pod that is properly secured. So it's actually, we'll use a container instead of a pod. We will use a kernel vulnerability called dirty pipe. Now, this is it's not a copy and write vulnerability. It's I'll get to the slide. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. The point is, it is secured. We rely upon the kernel for protection when we're running a container, because containers are an abstraction around a process. All the processes are running on the same kernel. And so if there's a vulnerability in the kernel code itself, the container is unable to protect itself. This slide is actually out of order because that's the containers are not a security boundary from the Right Honourable Chris Nova. Because the kernel is not a security boundary, sorry to jump around here, I've just misfingered those slides slightly. The point here is that nothing is a security boundary. Ultimately, nothing is entirely secure. And it's a question of leveling our risk tolerance. Okay, just to jump around one more time. So what will we do for this container breakout? Well, just as a reminder, within a pod, we are sharing a number of things. We share the pod configuration, the process. We have the network. So the loopback adapter in all containers in a pod points to the same network interface, which is a virtualized network interface that is plumbed through a container bridge, which is like a virtual switch, which then connects out to the host primary adapter, and that's how the networking is glued together. But the process and the mount and the C group namespaces, so the PID and the file system, should be separate per container unless we explicitly share them with a bunch of caveats and security fallibilities. We also have these virtual file system endpoints that the kernel provides for us, dev, which is our devices, as we saw, proc, which is a virtual file system for the process namespace, essentially, and sys, which is our kernel internals, as well as various other things. We do have a time namespace, but it is rarely used. And the user namespace is the reason we should not be running as root. User namespaces are coming, but they transcend the whole everything in Linux. Everything is a file, and ownership and permissions are fundamental to the Linux discretionary access control security model. So user namespaces are a frequent entry point for kernel vulnerabilities and are not used by default. There is a lot of work going on over the years, and there's a great talk at FOSDEM by Akihiro Suda on the latest and greatest there. But that is an implementation detail because we're going to look at dirty pipe. So this allows us to change any file on the host because it takes advantage of injecting code into memory that's owned by root. So the way that the kernel manages memory is memory is either marked as executable or not executable, and it's owned by somebody. So executable memory owned by root, if we can scribble our own bit of code in there, boom. That's what we want to do. That is an attacker's dream, because that bit of code is probably a reverse shell in some shape or form, or it's some form of persistence, or we drop an implant, or we just brick the machine, or we write some shell code, some shell code, or we mess with the bootloader, or any of those things. So this means that when the memory is executed, it has root's permission, even though root didn't put the code in there. So an unprivileged local user can use an exploit that allows it to write into that memory to escalate their own privilege. This is exactly what we're going to do here. There's also this proc self-exe bypass. So proc being the virtual file system, self being a secret symlink to the process's own identity. From process 1, that's proc 1. From process 100, it's proc 100. Exe is the executable that was taken from disk and copied into memory to be executed. It is a symlink back to the original executable, which in the case of run C meant that there was a specific breakout where an attacker could write down that symlink that was mounted into the container to overwrite the run C binary on the host, which is owned by root, so the next time that's executed, then whatever implant you've installed runs instead of run C. That was fixed by run C copying itself into memory and basically removing that symlink before running. We can exploit it here because it still exists, and that one layer of misdirection that was introduced for the fix is undone by this exploit, essentially. So what do? We write down this path. We can't patch the first byte because of page size foibles. So we have to write a very small implant, and we do that with some assembly. Okay, so we're going to break out of a container. Credit to my colleague JCP on our OffSec team for writing this. We actually authored this when Dirty Pipe was 2 weeks old, And it was a 0 day at that point, more or less. Not literally, of course, but there were plenty. I mean, there was no embargo on the CVE, so it was dropped to catastrophic international clamor. What shall we do? Let's get in here. So I have a virtual machine instead of compromising my host every day. Also, I need a specific kernel version, and obviously I'm patched on this device. Okay, so first of all, let us make sure that we have, where am I going, a vulnerable kernel version, as I'm sure you can guess. The answer is yes. Okay, 5.13, February the 7th last, it's getting on for, look at that, almost a year ago. What we will do then is have a look at what we've got going on in here. All right, so first of all, we start with the makefile. We are going to build everything. So we're going to build this very small implant. We mess with libseccomp to actually exploit the vulnerability itself. Weirdly, if we put seccomp inside a namespace in the container, it will be used. And I have minus 10 minutes, so I'm going to go backwards from here. And okay, where's my mouse gone? The interesting things here are libseccomp itself is, actually that's compiled, sorry. Let's go the bad libseccomp gen. There we go. It is just voided and empty for every method. So this goes inside the container, and it's used, which is a little bit of a surprise, of course. Let's make the damn thing. Let's make the thing like that. Okay, so we've then created a container. We've compiled our implant, run C small. We have built our malicious seccomp, which is then loaded into the dirty pipe C to generate the actual exploits. And we link procself.exe here, which is how things are going to blow up. Seccomp execution is how we get the code, the exploit to actually run. And with that, let's just make sure that we are an unprivileged user. And let's look at the root of the file system. Okay, very nice. So now from within a container, we are going to go make run. Okay, so sudo docker run breakout container. We've written the payload into memory. We're waiting for the shell. Now, to do this, we have to trigger, there we go. We have to trigger the runC binary to run. It pops a new window and it did that itself anyway. So now, who are we? We're the root user. And where are we? Instead of being in that container breakout directory, we're now in, let's do that. Run containerd, IO containerd, runtime task. That is the file system endpoint on the host in which the container image was unbundled and the pivot root system call set the container mount namespace to. So that's where the container actually literally runs, although the container abstractions prevent us from seeing that. But we just broke out of the container, so that's where we've been dropped, because that was the working directory that we were in. And you can see there as well, in this directory, we have the configuration of the container itself. This is a bad day, of course. Last thing to check is what am I doing? The process name, the processes, of course. And again, there we go, we're out on the host. There is our exploit running. So there we go. We've gone from inside the container, we've broken out onto the host. We are almost done. I can do it very quickly, I assure you. So we've exploited the kernel, fired a reverse shell to the container. So we actually did the same reverse shell trick we used across the internet, across the loopback adapter, and then routed the kubelet. This is a bad day. Always rebuild stuff, mutable infrastructure, la-di-da. Okay, so what does a container run on? It runs on a kubelet. What do we have? Well, you can see there we've got various things, but we also have temp mounts and environment variables. Those are a way for us to run secrets and mount them into containers, because wherever an empty dir is loaded, that's actually a tempfs directory, which is a way of creating a virtual file system in memory. So it's fast and it uses memory as opposed to disk. That is how all Kubernetes secrets are loaded. I should probably go back to my notes briefly. Yes, don't multi-tenant data classifications. These are the kittens of Kubernetes migrating between nodes, and they're terribly dangerous, as you can see. Okay, so cloud account takeover. What are we going to do here? Well, ideally, we are going to find some stolen AWS keys and use them to take over a cloud account in short order. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, first of all, we're actually going to cheat by going onto, I forgot to do this earlier, onto the host we were on. So we broke out of a container to get onto a kubelet host. I hope this infrastructure is actually up. That was probably worth testing. Assuming it is, then we will use, very nice, we will use my portable, there we go. So I have this bash collection of tools, of course, that I take with me everywhere, and I can bounce it into various different bits of infrastructure with this SSH enter enable. That's now posted it into here, magically sourced it, and I've got access to this tool called ksecrets file system dump. He says, hopefully, let's reset that. Ooh, what happened there? Okay, we're back. Let's go there. Cool. Okay, so what this does is it examines varlib kubelet pods, which is where all the pods are represented. Everything in a container or on Kubernetes must exist on disk at some point. And it looks for volume types of projected or bound. It's an implementation detail. Let's skip over it for now. And it looks for all of these things. Those things are Kubernetes RBAC mounted. So they're called service accounts, and they're mounted in. And we can see a whole list of them here. We've got all sorts of configurations, metrics agents. But what are we actually looking for? That's the slightly filleted version. Okay, there's loads of stuff in there. But let's look specifically for AWS keys. Great, I forgot to load them in as the vulnerable configuration. Let's cheat. That's funny, I did think I did that. Okay, mystically and magically, we're going to see secrets, hooray! Okay, why are these in here? Because people might be pushing to S3 buckets. They might think it's a good idea to dynamically create load balancers instead of creating them statically. For whatever reason, AWS keys exist in people's Kubernetes clusters and really should not. So, nice, we have got access to these. What can we do with them? Well, I'm sure you can guess. Let's go back one more time. So, we're looking to take over the cloud account with those keys. Let's try that again. Whoopsie-daisy, let's go there. Okay, so now what can we do? We load those access keys, and we run the AWS simple token service get caller identity. This will query AWS to identify who owns the keys and hopefully allow us to take things over. Oh dear. This is a bad day for not the defender, but the attacker, because this is a canary token. What this means is that the defender, who has carefully sprinkled these across their infrastructure, across their end user devices, across anywhere that they might be stolen by an attacker, has left them intentionally as a tripwire. Now this has been accessed. Their dashboard has lit up like a Christmas tree. I've been identified. These keys have no credentials. And what I thought was a sly cloud account takeover is actually notified. What's the point here? Well, nothing is entirely secure, and intrusion detection works to some extent, but can still be bypassed, misconfigured. Ultimately, canary tokens and honeypots, which is the slide that I jumped to here, he says, yeah, canary tokens and honeypots are the last line of defense. Canary tokens are super useful. You can have them in all sorts of things, in PDF files, at HTTP endpoints. They just released a new one, which actually escapes me, and I can't remember. Word documents, the whole shebang. You can also run honeypots, which, again, nobody should be running network scans inside your Kubernetes cluster. If that crypto wallet service receives network traffic, you know that it's non-legitimate because that is not behavior that was programmed into your application. What next? Kubernetes is vulnerable in lots of different ways. There's plenty of footguns. It is a generalized tool for plenty of specialized applications. It is possible to lock it down and make it secure, but it does require some effort. Lots of things in there. Pod treasure map is important. We do this for a living. If you're interested, please do come and see us. There are some books available. Thank you very much for your attention and have a lovely day.